Welcome to part 3 of advice for students who are going to be studying engineering.
And in this episode, we're basically going to be telling you what to expect because college, believe it or not, is going to be different than what you might have experienced in the past, particularly engineering.
And I would say that this is probably going to have another episode because there's a lot of things to expect. Number one, what's something that you could expect? I'm kind of winging this. You can probably expect classes to be a little bit more difficult than in high school.
Yeah, so college level classes in high school are your AP classes. They're also your dual credit classes, where you might be like, those dual credit classes, I'm pretty sure, are just based on the college curriculum. Some you might have had college level classes, so if you have that, you have experience with college level classes. But you're like a good way to put this. AP Calc BC is not the same as Calc 2. They're the same class. If you get credit for AP Calc BC with on the exam from the AP exam, you get credit for like Calc 2 is typically in like many universities what it's called. It's not like the same repeat class. Like in my experience, at least I tested out of it. Like I took the credit that I got from Calc BC. But from what I heard, it was just very, very rigorous in college. So there's not always a one-to-one comparison.
What I'm talking about is just the rigor and the what's involved. Like when you're taking a class in college, you're you're in a much more intimate setting with your teacher in high school than with the professor in a giant lecture hall. Maybe there's a little more leniency in high school. Maybe in high school, if the teacher notices that the class is not really getting something, maybe they'll put their foot on the brakes. But it's not so in college because
Yeah, you
we were
have to
talking
just
about the syllabus before, and we said in the syllabus you will get like every single day of every single lecture of the semester, you'll know exactly what's being covered, and they're likely not going to really want to
yeah.
put the brakes on that schedule.
When we talk about like classes and schedules and everything, of course it's different professor to professor,
Mm-hmm.
but generally speaking, your syllabus has a schedule. Your teacher has to cover that stuff in that schedule. They have to cover it in lecture.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the class is behind on some type of integration or some type of engineering concept, go to office hours to figure it out because the professor's just going to like keep talking about it. You know what I mean? Like I think that's what we're talking about. We're in high school. Like your teacher might be able to say, maybe we'll spend another day on this topic, adjust the exam accordingly, like understand where the class is actually at. The professor, like in college, there's a schedule for the class and that class is going to be moving at that schedule. So I think there's a lot of accountability for the students. And I think that's one of the big differences is that there's less check-ins and there's less how are you doing on this material. And as a student, you have to know how you're doing in the material. And one of the biggest challenges in that would be actually asking yourself, do I know this well enough? How do you do that?
You said accountability. There's actually not really anybody or anything really keeping you accountable except for the grade that you get in the class. That you have to keep yourself accountable. And then other thing I would say too, because there's so many classes are going to have more freedom than you have had before, most likely. And then another thing too is labs. I think labs. If you were in high school and you did a lab, maybe you did a lab during class and you took some measurements, and then in homework you wrote a report. But in engineering, from my experience within electrical engineering, those labs are like long labs. Maybe they're easier in the beginning of the semester, but then your labs will take time to do. And so much so that they're like their own sort of, in my experience, it was 2 credit courses. And then you work on your lab report outside of class, and that can take a long time.
Yeah, I think in my experience, the lab's like an hour or two for like you probably had different experience with electrical engineering than what I did with industrial, but like an hour or two to complete the lab.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard from EE just anecdotally, some of these labs can take a really long time to get the right amount of data and to be collecting what you need to be collecting, and it could be challenging in order to like set up the right stuff. But it's it's a lot, and the lab report is a lot too in terms of that. So that would be something that was added. I think my labs were 1 credit hour, but it could vary.
Another thing too. I know we keep bouncing around, but you're right with that stuff about electrical engineering. And I'm thinking about class, something you could expect is in lecture, or I would say a lot of students experience having to do a lot of learning outside of lecture. So taking the learning into your own hands and teaching, spending time on your own, a lot of time on your own outside of class, trying to understand the material better so that you understand it.
Yeah.
Not that lecture isn't useful, it is. It's just that the material sometimes can be so dense that you just need to put in time outside of lecture to understand it.
Yeah, I think lecture is where you get the foundational, and then outside of class, you kind of refine your understanding and refine your knowledge. Because exams too is not just going to be like pulled from homework or pulled from lecture, where you're going to have like the same type of problem that you've seen. Now that sometimes this happens, but like where you have like the same type of problem and it's just different numbers or some slightly different structure. You might in exam.
Sometimes it happens.
Sometimes it happens, but other times it's just completely different. And it's, oh, well, by like, and the reasoning on why you should maybe have known the answer during the exam would be by this principle, you should understand this relationship between these factors that we didn't explicitly went over, but it's technically like in the textbook and you're expected to know it. And so that's kind of the accountability, but also the self-studying and making sure that you know what you need to know. But I think like we're talking a lot about how it's different in terms of, and while we have a few minutes left in this video that we like to keep these two typically, some of the amazing things about studying engineering that you don't necessarily get in high school, because right now I feel like we've talked about how it's ramped up a little bit in terms of the speed, in terms of the accountability, but like what are some of the awesome stuff that you get to experience in engineering that you might not in your high school experience?
I would say there is the office hours is an interesting thing. Now, of course, you could always try to meet with your teacher outside of class in high school, but that sort of dedicated time. Another thing too is I think one thing with the flexibility is that like homework, in my experience, depends on the class, is typically due like once a week versus in high school if you have a class that's like meets 3 times a week. That's how it is in high school, right?
It could depend.
Depends on the class. Maybe you meet every day, but you're not typically having only one homework per week. From what I remember in high school, it's maybe you have a homework due twice a week.
So this goes to like ownership, where if you manage your time well and you like know what you're doing, you could actually, it could be like a really great experience because you get to structure your days and manage your time the way that you want to manage your time because you do have more freedom. Another thing that I wanted to, it's kind of, I'm forgetting, do you have something to add right now?
I was going to say, I think with the homework too, like you may have a professor that has homework due like every other week. But the thing is though, with whatever the homework is, don't wait until the last minute because you may be thinking, well, I need to set aside an hour or 2 for the homework. But then when you set aside that hour, you're like, wait, I actually need 5. You might come across a scenario where I need 5 hours to do the homework.
Yeah. Another difference that I want to call out, this is just because you mentioned professors and that was what I was thinking of earlier. The professors can actually be a lot more of like a professional relationship than in high school with your teachers. So your professors, you could be doing research with your professors. Right. They could have industry connections. They could help you with your interview. You actually like because the content can be really deep and it's specialized, typically specialized to that professor, and they've spent a while like focusing on that material. If it's something that you're really interested in, or this professor's doing research that you really like, you have the opportunity to get a lot of cool experiences doing research or talking about industry and learning things from that professor. So it could be like a very intellectually fruitful relationship.
So I think, yes, that opportunity to get to know your professors well is something that's different.
Plus, you're also in class with students who have the same interests. So beyond freshman, like first year engineering, if you're in even then, it's students who are interested in engineering. Depending on how your high school is set up, you might not have had that before, where your whole class is really interested and focused on studying, majoring, and learning about math, science, engineering. Yep. And so that's a cool like peer group to be a part of too. And you can definitely learn a lot from other people coming in with different experiences. So that's cool. There's exciting parts about it too. So
that wraps up for today. Or this episode. If you're interested in seeing more advice or you have any questions about engineering, let us know in the comments and we might talk about that in another episode.